This is the first in a series of videos that responds to custom questions about the national survey of the Afghan people. The Asian Foundation has been doing this survey every year since 2004, except for 2005. So that leads us to 10 years of annual data. It's all publicly available data. And there are more than 60,000 respondents in 34 provinces. We encourage you to take a look actually at the online website where you can play with the visualizations. You can click on a question, for example, like how much sympathy does a person have for armed opposition groups, and look at a particular region and then compare year by year for different regions. So I encourage you to take a look at that. We received a question from Anders Wierock at the Norwegian Embassy, as well as from the Norwegian ambassador himself, asking about the relationship between education and some major indicators for development. Specifically, he said, it's often heard that education is important for peace and democracy and economic development, but to what extent is this really the case? There's certainly the Afghan proverb, Shanidan kai buwad manande didam, which means seeing is not, or hearing is not always seeing or knowing. So you can't always trust what you hear. And in Afghanistan, we know that madrasa education is very common, Islamic madrasa education. The word madrasa simply means school, but there's also private and public schools available to many Afghans, and that is growing every year in terms of availability and access. So what does our data say? We took a look, and we're going to go over with you the methods, the key findings, and some of the limitations of our research as well. We used what's called regression analysis, and regression analysis is a way of isolating single variables from other variables through statistical procedures. And we took a look at our data from 2006 to 2013, and we poked around for variables that related to democracy, and variables related to peace, and variables related to development. And we picked 2 years where we had a lot of these variables that we could compare to see what is the relationship between education and each of these sets. So under democracy, the primary variables were support for women's rights, and this was a scale including whether Afghans thought that women should be allowed to work outside the home, whether they should have access to education, whether they should have equal participation in politics as men, as well as satisfaction with the way democracy works in Afghanistan, reconciliation with armed opposition groups, whether they think that's something that will be effective or not, as well as development variables like income and comparing today to Taliban times in terms of economic household condition.
So I'm going to talk about these 5 indicators that we chose for democracy, peace, and economic development. The first 2 models are for democracy, third model is for peace, and the last 2 is for economic development. So we actually what we did, we ran regression analysis of demographic variables such as gender, marital status, geographic code, which is urban or rural geographic place they're living, and age. And we came to see how much of these 4 variables, demographic variables, explain the changes in support for women's rights, for satisfaction of how democracy works, reconciliation with AOGs, income, and past versus present condition of Afghans. So the R-square here shows how much in terms of percentage is these demographic variables are able to explain the changes on these dependent variables. And the highest is the support for women's rights, which is 14%, is explained by demographic variables. And in the second table, the same set of indicators, demographic indicators, and we added the educational level, the highest education level an Afghan earned, the respondents, and we see the changes in the R-square, and the R-square in the first model, fourth model, and fifth model are significantly increased by the first model of more than 1%, which is due to the changes, which is due to the addition of education in our regression model. So we see that the education has impact on support for women's rights, income, and past present condition. So and for the second and third model, we don't see any significant increase in the R-square. And then we added more indicators such as mixed religion and politics, confidence in parliament, perception of corruption, and fear, which is in a scale, reliable scale. And we see the changes in our. We see in the model that education has significant impact on the first model, which is support for women's rights, but not significant impact on the second and third, which is satisfaction of how democracy works, and reconciliation of support for reconciliation efforts of the government with the armed opposition groups. And the fourth and fifth, the economic indicators, the education has high impact. And so our key findings are,
as you can see, across all these models, we see that education is increasing support for women's rights. That's a robust finding, as well as for economic development indicators. So we can sort of predict that as your education level goes up, you're more likely to earn more income and have more access to employment. However, there's no significant relationship, at least in our data using these models, between education and how whether somebody's satisfied with how democracy works in Afghanistan. Nor is there a significant relationship between education level and attitudes towards reconciliation with armed opposition groups, the efforts by the Afghan government to reconcile with those groups, which include the Taliban. One thing to note, however, is that education, peace, democracy, these are pretty difficult to operationalize. Income, however, is much easier. Income is a continuous variable, and it's easier to measure. How do you measure support for peace or support for democracy? These are difficult to put into any type of survey, qualitative or quantitative, in a way that you can see broad effects controlling for different variables. There's also another component to this, which is that level of schooling, what we measure, doesn't always translate to education. As Mark Twain said, I've never let my schooling interfere with my education. And by that, I suppose he meant that the two are different. The other challenge is that in Afghanistan, most of the population, over 60% in our survey over 10 years, don't have any education whatsoever. That's no formal schooling, not even a literacy class. We can see here, for example, on this chart, this is the percentage of people with no formal schooling whatsoever, 70 to 75% in, for example, these two provinces. If you look down in the green areas is where you have the highest reported levels of schooling on average, meaning that could be, on average, 1 year of schooling, could be 2 or 3, but it's extremely small. So we're skewed in terms of our data. Education as a variable is difficult to measure because there's not a lot of variation when you have 60% of your population with no schooling whatsoever. The other limitation we had was that we don't have indicators for all the years that we were hoping for. It's also challenging to measure the difference between quality versus quantity, as Mark Twain sort of gestured to. And we also have a limited sample size, so we were dealing with around a little over 12,000 sample size for these 2 years. And in certain booster provinces, we have over 400, but on average, we were coming around 100 to 200 respondents per province. So that concludes our brief presentation on education and its relationship to these development indicators, and we welcome from you some additional questions for custom analysis.